Frankenstein is a story we all think we know, a literary creation that has become part of popular culture. But reading the original book can come as something of a surprise, revealing far more than just the famous monster myth.
What's going on here is a critique of the solitary genius.
It's about a man who really wants to murder his family.
I'm Professor Alice Roberts, author and anatomist. In this film, I want to examine the anatomy of Frankenstein the novel to understand the act of artistic creation behind it. I'll follow its author, Mary Shelley, from the churchyard in St Pancras where she courted Percy Shelley, to the villa in Geneva where the famous tale was first conceived. I'll examine the manuscript of Frankenstein for clues about the unusual way in which it was written, and discover how ideas about creation and authorship are woven into the fabric of the novel. I'm really intrigued by this book. I'm intrigued by the themes in it. It grabs me as a human, it grabs me as an anatomist, but I want to understand how it was written. I want to understand why it was written, and I really want to understand what Mary Shelley thought it was about. Frankenstein tells the story of an obsessive scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who creates a man and brings him to life. The creature teaches himself to read and learns what it is to be human, but he's shunned by a hostile society and denied companionship.
When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned?
Abandoned and alienated, the creature is driven to kill all the people his creator loves. The story has become shorthand for the dangers of science run amok, but the book has also been viewed as a political novel, a feminist novel, a novel about a godless world. Is it possible that all of these themes were present in the debut novel of an 18-year-old writing at the beginning of the 19th century? My first clue in deciphering Frankenstein is to understand the ideas that Mary Shelley's parents wrote about and tried to live by. Mary came from an incredibly intellectual family. Her father was William Godwin, the radical philosopher, writer, and anarchist. Godwin argued that society and ownership were corrupting forces and that mankind would be more virtuous if we returned to a state of nature, ideas that echo through Frankenstein. And her mother was the radical feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft had led an extraordinary life before she met Godwin. She already had a child from an affair she'd had in revolutionary Paris, and she'd written a bold polemic arguing the case for equality for women. So this is Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And it's just extraordinary. She says, women are not allowed to have sufficient strength of mind to acquire what really deserves the name of virtue. It's great, I love it. But it's no wonder that Horace Walpole called her a hyena in petticoats. Both of her parents used their writing as a straightforward means to convey forceful beliefs. I want to find out how much that's true of Frankenstein as well. I'm going to Cambridge to meet Professor Nora Crook, who's an expert in the writing of the Romantic period and in the work of Mary Shelley in particular. I want to understand what other ideas are woven into Frankenstein alongside the gripping horror story.
Welcome!
Hello, Nora.
I think she was intending the book to be morally difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there will be people who will be sympathetic to Frankenstein, there will be others who will be sympathetic to the monster, you know. And I think she is trying to make people feel uncomfortable about what should we do, you know, what should human beings do.
To explore these ideas, the reader has to navigate their way through a labyrinthine structure. The novel opens with a series of letters from an Arctic explorer, Robert Walton, to his sister, recounting how he has come across a half-dead Victor Frankenstein on the ice. Frankenstein's story is enclosed within Walton's letters, and within Frankenstein's story is the creature's narrative, reported in his own voice.
Cursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours.
The creature becomes monstrous only after he's abandoned and mistreated by the people around him, a fate that reflects the ideas of Mary's father, William Godwin, about human nature and society.
I read it as a political novel, and I also read it as a novel about philosophical problems, particularly free will versus necessity. You know, do we have free will? I think is a very prominent question that gets asked throughout the novel, and in the end, we don't know. I mean, or at least she doesn't come out with a conclusive answer. But I think it is to make you think about how far we have choices. Could Frankenstein have acted any differently? Could the creature have acted any differently? You know, you can say that. It's very much a novel of ideas, I think, rather than character. They're not intended to be domestic and exactly like people you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, so that they're almost vehicles for particular emotions or particular
Yes.
feelings or other kind of abstract
Yes.
thoughts.
Or unconscious fears. It's interesting that he chooses that his creature should be a man. Frankenstein has not chosen to make a primal pair, an Adam and an Eve. He only makes an Adam. So, again, some readings of Frankenstein says that that's his hidden desire. He only wants an all-male world. He would like to eliminate women, mothers, people who give birth and then die and leave you. But Frankenstein is certainly skewed towards the idea of birth and death and life and so on, being confused.
It's not surprising that Mary Shelley saw birth and death as so closely intertwined. Her own mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died of an infection following childbirth, just 11 days after baby Mary had been born. Mary Wollstonecraft was buried here in the churchyard of Old St Pancras in London.
As a teenager, Mary would often come here. She'd often escape to the graveyard, to her mother's grave. She'd bring books here and she'd read. She'd bring meals here to eat and occasionally even sleep here as well. So it was a place of refuge for her, but also a place where she could feel close to the mother that she'd lost.
When you know that Mary's birth was essentially the cause of her mother's death, it's hard not to read that theme of interlinked birth and death into Mary's novel. But for Mary, this graveyard held further significance. It featured in her courtship with the most important figure in her life and another vital influence on the shaping of Frankenstein.
By the age of 16, Mary had met and fallen in love with the poet Percy Shelley, who was a great admirer of her father's philosophical writings and his thinking, and Shelley often came to visit their house. That's how he met Mary. The two of them would escape here.
He wrote this poem to her in 1814, when their relationship was just beginning.
Thy lips did meet mine tremblingly. Thy dark eyes threw their soft persuasion on my brain, charming away its dream of pain. Reserve or censure, come not near our sacred friendship, lest there be no solace left for thee and me. It's not surprising that Percy Shelley is speaking of reserve and censure. He was a married man. Mary was embarking on an affair that would outrage even her father. And in the same year he wrote that poem, they ran away together. They eloped to the continent.
For the next 2 years, their life was a succession of makeshift homes as they moved across Europe, running from debt and scandal. Entries from their shared diary show a couple with a voracious intellectual appetite, reading and exchanging ideas daily. 7 months after her elopement with Percy, Mary gave birth to a premature baby, a daughter, who only lived for a few days. A diary entry from that time reads, "I dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby." For some, this passage is evidence that Mary was already thinking about the idea of bringing the dead back to life, even before she started writing Frankenstein. By May of 1816, the couple, accompanied by her stepsister Claire, had come here to Geneva.
The Romantic poets were really moved by the idea of the sublime in nature, and so the landscape around here attracted them. But so did the city, because it had a reputation for being welcoming to free thinkers and exiles. It had been home to Rousseau and to Voltaire. So Geneva represented this place that they could come to where they could live freely and think freely, where they could escape from the narrow confines and constraints of English society.
During their time in Geneva, the party became frequent visitors to this house, the Villa Diodati, home that summer to the poet Lord Byron.
The summer of 1816 was known as the Summer of Darkness. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the year before had disrupted weather patterns right across Europe and heralded a summer of almost constant rain.
The party were cooped up indoors for days at a time.
It was here, in that damp, dark summer of 1816, that the story of Frankenstein was born.
Years later, in the preface to the 1831 edition of the book, Mary wrote her own account of what happened here in Geneva. "We will each write a ghost story," said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to.
I busied myself to think of a story, one to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of his heart.
The others all started their stories, but Mary couldn't think of one.
I felt that blank incapability of invention, which is the greatest misery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations. "Have you thought of a story?" I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative.
But in fact, this gathering of people and ideas proved to be the perfect breeding ground for her story to be born.
Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated.
Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest. In the preface, Mary Shelley tells us that the idea of Frankenstein and his creature came to her in a waking dream. I saw with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the workings of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy half-vital motion. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. Mary's account of her dream has all the hallmarks of the classic romantic idea of a sudden flash of inspiration. Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed that the poem of Kubla Khan came to him fully formed in a drug-induced vision. But in truth, there was more to the creation of the Frankenstein story than just this inspirational dream. To find out more about the complex tale of how the book was born, I'm going to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Here, behind these thick stone walls, is the earliest surviving manuscript of Frankenstein.
I'm really looking forward to seeing the story written in her own handwriting. I think also because obviously I've come here to this beautiful place. I mean, this is the Bodleian Library, it's gorgeous. It feels quite sacred in a way, and it feels like I'm on a pilgrimage to go and look at a relic. This is incredibly exciting. So these have been rebound, but what is inside this quite modern looking book are pages from Mary Shelley's original notebook that she was writing in between July 1816 and April 1817. So this is the earliest surviving manuscript of Frankenstein. In her own handwriting. So I know this is a notebook and it's rough workings and things are crossed out, but it's not just scribbled notes after a dream. This is a book. I've got the words which open what is now chapter 5. Was in this version chapter 7. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld my man, it looks like. And what we have here is the description of the monster as he comes to life. And I had selected his features as beautiful. Now she's crossed out handsome. She wrote handsome again. She's crossed that out and then settled on beautiful, his features as beautiful.
But if you look closely at that word beautiful and at other minor notes and changes across the text, it becomes clear that this is different handwriting. You can find the same word written in 2 different hands, so it's possible to compare them.
I've got the word authors here, and I've got it again here in the second hand as a correction. So if we have a look at that, quite a round A, or it's rounded at least in form at the top, and then it's quickly up, and then a real quick flicking return. Also, that looks like it's been written a little more slowly. But certainly it's impossible to believe that that word, authors, was written by the same person that wrote author there.
Experts have spent 5 years studying the manuscript to clarify which words belong to which hand. In the original, of course, it's Mary. In the corrections, it's Percy Shelley. The manuscript also holds a few private notes and comments alongside the Frankenstein text. Yes, look at this. Igmatic, she's written. IGMMATIC, which I think even nearly 200 years ago was not a word. It's been crossed out, it's been replaced with enigmatic, and that's been written in pencil, and then it's been inked over. But there's something else here as well. In the same pencil as the crossing out and the correction underneath that ink, it says, "Oh, you pretty Pexy." I know how I feel when I write and when people change my writing, but nobody's ever written "Oh, you pretty Pexy" alongside an amendment that they've made to my writing. Yeah, I think I'd feel that was just more than a little patronising. But is that how Mary Shelley would have seen it? Professor Michael Rossington is an expert in the work of both Mary and Percy Shelley, and he studied the contributions that each have made to the other's work. I just wondered what the relationship was between them when it comes to writing.
Their relationship is one of close intellectual intimacy. They are companions, if you like, in terms of their reading, in terms of their thinking. And I think that what the manuscript shows is that dialogue between them, one in which both parties, if you like, are willing participants on equal terms. This is a life in which there's, if you like, a dedication to reading on a daily basis, sharing ideas, constantly in conversation with one another.
It's really difficult for me just looking at a few pages to get a feel for how much he changed the book from her original. I mean, do you think his editing changed it completely, or was it fairly light touch?
In terms of his interventions, his revisions of particular words, and indeed occasionally there are passages that he inserts. Most of those occur in Victor's narrative, very few in that of the creature. You could argue that there were aspects of, if you like, Percy's own experience that made it relatively easy for him to ventriloquise, to talk in the language of an extremely bright, energetic, bold young man.
If Mary's allowing Percy to modify the part of Victor Frankenstein, perhaps she saw parallels between the two.
Some critics have felt that Frankenstein is critiquing Percy and indeed her father, William Godwin, that they too, if you like, are in danger of allowing their ideas, their intellectual interests to override their responsibilities towards others.
Yeah, becoming so kind of focused on their ideals that they kind of forget the people around them.
You could argue that what's going on here is a critique of the notion of the solitary genius, which is
a romantic ideal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
At the heart, you could say, of many ideas and much of the writing about Romanticism.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's echoes then in the way the book is created, in the theme of the book, which has something to say about the folly of trying to create something on your own, perhaps.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Frankenstein challenges the idea of the obsessive solo visionary, even in the way it was written, which was cooperative and collaborative. But this isn't the only hidden message in the novel.
This is from the narrative, Victor's narrative. You'll see there, last Thursday, in brackets, May with 26 crossed out.
And she's immediately...
And then she's immediately,
yeah.
That's right, she's immediately corrected it to the 28th.
So why has she done that then?
Well, because
because it sounds better?
She wants to, she has a particular year in mind.
The letters in the book are never fully dated, but by calculating which years in the 1700s had the 28th of May as a Thursday and using other clues, we can work out that the year of this first letter would have been 1796.
Many critics have pointed out that the period between the first letter and the final letter at the end of the novel is roughly a kind of 9-month period. Mary was born on the 30th of August, 1797. So, in fact, Walton's first letter to his sister dates from around about the time when Mary thought of herself as having been conceived. Wow. So, encoded in the novel, you could say, is
her own conception.
Her own conception.
And her own development. That's amazing.
So, the final letter dates from 12th September, and we know that in terms of Mary Shelley's life, that was 2 days after the death of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft.
In this final letter, Walton writes that Victor Frankenstein has died and that he has seen the creature disappear alone across the ice. These fictional events are dated to play in parallel with Mary Wollstonecraft's death and the beginning of Mary's life without her mother.
There's so many different layers in this book. I mean, I find it astonishing, all these themes that we're talking about. Do you think that the 18-year-old Mary Shelley was really, she's really aware of all of those? That's what she was doing. That's what she was doing with this book, was trying to talk about those themes, using the story of Frankenstein's monster as a vehicle for doing that.
If you look at the background and you look at her upbringing and the kind of breadth and depth of her intellectual development, I'm sure that it makes sense that this imaginative work of literature should have all these ramifications, all these possibilities that readers have found over the centuries since it was first published.
It's been fascinating to retrace the footsteps of Mary Shelley and discover how this incredible book was born. I love the romantic story of the terrifying dream in Geneva, but this novel is so much more than just a horror story. Its layering of voices allowed Mary to present ideas and to critique them at the same time. So many aspects from her own life, her reading, the lives and ideas of her parents, and her relationship with Percy Shelley are shared and examined through the prism of the novel.
This book, which seems as though it's going to be about lightning and monsters and darkness and some kind of trashy gothic horror, is actually about people, and it's about how people interact with each other.
It is a horror story which deals in death, but which ultimately provokes us to ask questions about how we live.